The arrow struck the carriage wheel a hand's width from Alira Voss's head, and the whole procession lurched to a stop in the middle of the forest road. Horses screamed. Wood splintered. Somewhere in the tree line, unseen archers were already knocking a second volley, and the guards around the bridal carriage had no time to shout orders before 3 more arrows hissed through the morning fog and buried themselves in the carriage door. She threw herself flat against the cushioned seat, heart slamming against her ribs, while her handmaiden Rosalind grabbed her wrist and pulled her lower still. Outside, steel rang against steel. Men were dying in the mud only a few feet from where the 2 women crouched, and neither of them could see who was attacking or why. "Stay down," Rosalind whispered, though her voice shook so badly, the words barely held together. Alira pressed her palm against the wall of the carriage and tried to think past the roar of her own blood. She was supposed to be married in 3 days. She was supposed to be delivered safely to the mountain fortress of a king she had never met. A king whose name alone made grown soldiers lower their eyes. Instead, she was going to die on a forest road before she ever saw his face. Then, through the chaos, came a sound unlike anything she had heard before. A deep, rolling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by the crash of something enormous moving through the underbrush. The archers in the trees stopped shooting. Men who had been shouting orders a moment before went silent, and in that silence, Alira heard heavy footsteps circling the carriage, footsteps far too large and far too fast to belong to any man. A shape passed the small window slit, blotting out the gray daylight for half a second. Fur, claws, the suggestion of a face that was not entirely human. Then it was gone, moving toward the tree line where the archers had been hiding, and the growling turned into something closer to a roar that shook loose leaves from the branches above. By the time the fighting stopped, Alira's hands would not stop trembling, though she forced herself to sit up straight when the carriage door finally opened. The man who opened it was not the king. He was tall, dark-haired, with sharp gray eyes and the calm, measured movements of someone used to command. He introduced himself simply as Kale, first advisor to King Draven Ashwolf, and told her, in a voice that offered no comfort at all, that the ambush had been dealt with, and that they would continue on to the fortress within the hour. "Who attacked us?" Alira asked, forcing steadiness into her own voice to match his. "That," Kale said, "is a question for later. For now, my lady, you are safe. That is what matters." She did not feel safe. She felt like a piece on a board that other people were moving, and she had felt that way since the day her father first told her she would be married to the Lycan king, to end a war that had bled both their peoples dry for 3 generations. Nathaniel Voss, her father, was a respected member of the Human Council, a man who had spent 20 years arguing for peace, while younger men on both sides kept dying at the border. When the treaty finally came together, it came with a single condition neither side would abandon: a marriage between the crown of the Lycan territories and a daughter of the council, to bind the peace in blood and vow the way no signed paper ever could. Alira had not been the first choice. 2 other young women, daughters of more prominent council families, had been considered before her, and both families had quietly withdrawn their daughters once they understood exactly what an arranged marriage to a Lycan king might involve. There were stories about the fortress in the north, stories about brides who had gone in weak and human and never adjusted to a court of giants and wolves. Nobody said the word death directly. Nobody had to. Alira's father had asked her once, alone in his study, if she truly wanted this. She remembered the lamplight on his tired face, the way his hands would not stay still on the desk. "I want the killing to stop," she had told him. "If this is the price, then I will pay it." She had believed those words when she said them. She still believed them now, sitting in a battered carriage with arrow holes in the door, her pulse only now beginning to slow. The rest of the journey passed in a strange, watchful quiet. The mountains rose higher and closer with every mile, gray stone slopes disappearing into low clouds, and the air grew colder, even though it was not yet winter. Rosalind kept glancing at Alira as if waiting for her to break down, and Alira kept refusing to give her the satisfaction, because breaking down accomplished nothing, and there was no one left to catch her if she did. When the fortress finally came into view, it was larger than anything Alira had imagined. Black stone walls climbed the mountainside like something grown rather than built, and banners bearing a silver wolf's head snapped in the wind above towers that seemed to scrape the low clouds. Guards along the wall were not all human in shape. Some stood taller than any man Alira had ever seen, their shoulders too broad, their eyes catching torchlight in a way that made her stomach tighten. The gates opened without a sound, which somehow frightened her more than if they had groaned like the gates of every human keep she had ever visited. Inside the courtyard, a crowd had gathered. Nobles in fine northern dress stood alongside warriors in battle leathers, and pack elders, with silver hair and sharp eyes, watched the carriage approach, with expressions Alira could not read. She had expected hostility. What she found instead was something closer to curiosity mixed with pity, as if the entire court already knew something about her fate that she did not. An older woman, with silver-streaked hair, and a long fur-lined cloak stepped forward first. She introduced herself as Helena, one of the eldest pack elders, and her eyes moved over Alira with a slow, careful assessment that made Alira feel like livestock being appraised at market. "So small," Helena murmured, not quite to herself. "They always send us the small ones." "I am stronger than I look," Alira said, before she could stop herself. Something flickered across Helena's face, not quite a smile. "We will see." Kale guided her through the courtyard and into the great hall, where the ceiling rose so high that torchlight barely reached the rafters, and stone pillars carved with wolf heads lined a floor polished smooth by centuries of feet. At the far end, on a throne built from black wood and iron, sat the king. Alira had heard descriptions of Draven Ashwolf before, delivered in hushed, nervous tones by advisors and travelers who claimed to have seen him. Nothing had prepared her for the reality of him. He was enormous, easily a head and shoulders taller than the largest man in her father's guard, with a build that suggested raw, barely restrained power, even while sitting still. His hair was dark, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, when they finally settled on her, held no warmth at all. They held calculation, assessment. The same cold weighing she had seen in Helena's gaze, only sharper. He did not rise from his throne to greet her. He did not smile, did not offer a single word of welcome. He simply watched her cross the long hall, his expression unreadable, and Alira understood in that moment exactly what kind of marriage she had agreed to. This was not a man waiting for a wife. This was a king, enduring an obligation, and she was the obligation. "You survived the road," he said finally, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the stone floor itself. "I am told there was an attempt on the caravan." "There was," Alira answered, keeping her chin level despite the way her legs wanted to shake. "Your advisor's people dealt with it." "They will deal with whoever sent it as well," Draven said, and something dangerous moved behind his eyes. "No one attacks what belongs to this pack without paying for it." The word belongs settled over her like a weight. She was not yet his wife. The ceremony was still 3 days away, and yet already he spoke of her as property, as a possession under threat rather than a person who had nearly died an hour ago. Kale cleared his throat carefully. "My king, perhaps the lady should be shown to her chambers to rest before." "Yes," Draven said, already looking away, already dismissing her from his attention, as easily as he might dismiss a servant. "See that she is comfortable. The wedding proceeds as planned." There was no cruelty in his tone, which somehow made it worse. Cruelty could be answered, argued with, resisted. Indifference simply closed every door before she had a chance to reach for one. As Kale led her from the hall, Alira allowed herself one glance back. Draven had already turned to speak with one of his generals, his massive frame relaxed against the throne, the near death of his future wife apparently no longer worth a second thought. She felt something cold settle in her chest, a certainty that she would spend the rest of her life in this fortress, fighting to be seen as more than a treaty clause with a heartbeat. Rosalind caught up to her in the corridor outside the hall, her face pale. "He did not even ask if you were hurt." "He asked if the caravan survived," Alira said quietly. "That was close enough for him." That night, alone in a chamber larger than her entire childhood home, with a fire burning in a hearth big enough to stand in, and northern wind howling against shuttered windows, Alira sat by the fire and allowed herself, finally, to shake. Not from fear of the arrows on the road, though those had been terrifying enough. She shook from the certainty settling deep in her bones that she had just walked into a marriage with a man who saw her as nothing more than a piece of paper given flesh, a debt paid to end a war, and that no matter what happened over the next 3 days, no matter what vows were spoken in front of his court, she would still be exactly that to him when it was over. She thought of her father's tired eyes, of the years of border deaths he had fought so hard to end, and she reminded herself why she had agreed to any of this. Peace was worth more than her comfort. Peace was worth more than being wanted. She only hoped it would be worth what it was already beginning to cost her. Outside her window, far below in the training yard, she could hear Draven's voice carrying across the stone, sharp and commanding, already discussing security measures for the wedding, already treating her safety as a logistical problem rather than a matter of the heart. Elira closed her eyes and forced her breathing to slow, forced the shaking in her hands to still. 3 more days, she told herself. 3 more days, and then she would belong to this fortress, and this cold, towering king, whether either of them wanted it or not. Whatever came after that, she would face it the way she had faced the arrows on the road, without breaking, without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She did not yet know that in 3 days, a single gust of wind would tear away more than just a veil. She did not know that it would tear away years of grief the king had buried so deep, even his own advisors did not know its shape, and that the face beneath her veil would shake the foundations of the fortress far more than any arrow ever could. For now, she only knew the cold of the northern night, the distant howl of wolves that were not entirely animal, and the quiet, stubborn resolve settling into her chest that whatever happened next, she would not go into it as a victim. She would go into it as herself. The morning of the wedding began with a scream from the servants' corridor, and for one terrible heartbeat, Elira thought the assassins from the forest road had followed her all the way into the fortress itself. She was already awake, already dressed in the plain gray gown she wore for early hours, when Rosalind burst through her chamber door, with her hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes wide with something between horror and disbelief. A wolf, Rosalind managed, in the east wing. It got past the guards. It was in the nursery corridor. Is anyone hurt? Elira was already moving toward the door. Years of watching her father handle crises during border skirmishes, taking over before fear had a chance to catch up with her. No, the pack caught it before it reached anyone. But my lady, it was not one of theirs. Not one of the king's wolves. Someone smuggled it in. By the time Elira reached the courtyard, a crowd had already gathered, and at the center of it stood Draven, still in his sleeping clothes, one massive hand wrapped around the throat of the wolf in question, holding the snarling animal a full foot off the ground as easily as another man might hold a misbehaving hound. "Where?" Draven said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried across the entire courtyard without him needing to raise it. "Did this come from?" No one answered. The wolf, wild-eyed and clearly starved half to madness, could give no answer even if it wanted to, and the guards who should have stopped it at the gate stood pale and silent, unable to explain how it had slipped past them. Elira watched from the edge of the crowd, and for the first time since arriving at the fortress, she saw something in Draven's expression that was not cold calculation. It was fury, yes, but underneath the fury was something closer to fear, quickly buried, quickly smoothed over, into the composed mask of a king in control of his court. "Search every corridor," Draven ordered, releasing the wolf into the hands of 2 guards, who dragged it away, toward the lower cells. "Double the watch at every gate. If someone can smuggle a starving animal into this fortress a day before my wedding, they can smuggle in worse." Kale appeared at his side, speaking low and urgent, and though Elira could not hear the words, she could read the tension in both men's shoulders well enough. Someone did not want this wedding to happen. First arrows on the forest road, now a wild animal loose in the halls where children of the fortress staff slept at night. Whoever was working against this marriage was growing bolder, not more cautious, and that frightened Elira more than either incident on its own. She approached Kale later that morning, catching him alone in a quiet corridor between council meetings, and asked the question directly, rather than waiting for someone to decide she did not need the answer. "Who wants this wedding stopped badly enough to risk 2 attacks in 1 week?" Kale studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether she deserved honesty or another polite deflection. Something in her steady gaze must have convinced him, because he finally answered, "There are factions on both sides who profit from the war continuing, my lady. Human merchants who sell weapons to both armies. Lycan nobles who gain standing through the fighting and stand to lose it in peace. Any of them could be behind this, perhaps all of them together. And the king believes one of his own people might be working against him." The king, Kale said carefully, trusts very few people completely. It has kept him alive this long. Alira thought of the way Draven had looked at her in the Great Hall the day before, cold and assessing, and wondered whether that same distrust extended to her as well. Perhaps especially to her, the human bride he had never chosen, delivered to his fortress by a council full of politicians he had no reason to fully believe. The wedding preparations continued despite the unease hanging over the fortress. Servants moved through the halls, hanging silver banners alongside the pack's wolf sigil. Cooks prepared a feast large enough to fill 3 great halls, and somewhere in the depths of the fortress, seamstresses put final stitches into the gown Alira would wear that evening. A heavy silk creation trimmed in northern fur that felt far too formal for a marriage neither party particularly wanted. Helena, the pack elder, came to Alira's chamber that afternoon, ostensibly to help her prepare, though Alira suspected the older woman had come mostly to observe. "You did not flee after the wolf," Helena said, watching Alira's reflection in the mirror as a servant fastened the final clasps of the wedding gown. Many brides would have demanded to go home after 2 attacks in 1 week. "Would that have been the wise choice?" Alira asked. "Wisdom and courage are not always the same thing," Helena said. "But you show both, it seems. That is rare among the humans we have been sent." A pause. "It may even be rare among the wolves." "Is that a compliment, Elder Helena?" The old woman's mouth curved, the closest thing to warmth Alira had seen from her yet. "It is an observation. Compliments are for later, once we see whether courage is enough to survive a season in this fortress." As evening approached and the wedding hour drew closer, Alira stood before the long mirror in her chamber and studied her own reflection, barely recognizing herself beneath the heavy silk and the elaborate braided crown of hair the servants had arranged. The veil, thick northern lace, edged in silver thread, waited on a stand beside her, ready to be lowered over her face the moment she stepped into the great hall. She thought of her father, hundreds of miles south in the council chambers, likely pacing the halls with worry, even now. She thought of the arrows on the forest road, the wolf in the corridor, the cold weight of Draven's gaze the day before. She thought of everything that had gone wrong in the span of a single week, and told herself, firmly, that none of it changed why she had come here in the first place. Peace. Her people. Safe. His people. Safe. An end to the killing that had claimed cousins and neighbors and strangers alike for 3 generations before her birth. If that required standing before a cold king, in a fortress full of secrets and enemies she could not yet name, then she would stand there with her spine straight and her chin level, exactly as she had in the great hall the day before. Rosalind arrived to walk her to the ceremony, her earlier fright from the morning's wolf incident replaced now by a kind of nervous determination that mirrored Alira's own. "Are you ready, my lady?" Alira looked once more at her reflection, at the veil waiting to be lowered, and thought of all the things that veil would hide. Her fear, her uncertainty. Whatever expression crossed her face when she finally stood before the king and the entire watching court, and became, officially, his wife. "As ready as I will ever be," she said, and let Rosalind lower the veil over her face. The walk to the great hall felt longer than it had the day before, though the distance had not changed. Torches lined the corridor, their light diffused and golden through the lace of her veil, and somewhere ahead, she could hear the low murmur of the assembled court, hundreds of voices hushing to silence as she approached the doors. The doors opened. Every eye in the hall turned toward her, human and Lycan alike, nobles in silk and warriors in leather, and pack elders in fur-lined robes, all of them watching the bride who had survived arrows and a smuggled wolf in the span of a single week walk toward the throne, where their king waited. Draven stood at the base of the dais, no longer seated in cold distance the way he had been the day before, dressed now in formal black and silver that made his already massive frame seem to fill half the hall on its own. His expression, what she could see of it through the veil's fine lace, remained composed, unreadable, the same mask he wore in every public moment. She reached him. The officiant, an old woman with silver braids and a voice like grinding stone, began the ceremony, speaking words about peace and blood, and binding that Alira only half heard over the roar of her own pulse in her ears. Draven's hands, when he finally reached for hers, were warm and impossibly large, engulfing her fingers entirely, and she felt him hesitate for just a moment, before completing the gesture the ceremony required. "Do you accept this union?" the officiant intoned. "To bind your houses, your peoples, and your blood, until death parts you." Draven's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I accept." The words landed heavier than Alira expected, final in a way that made the reality of what she was doing settle fully into her chest for the first time. She spoke her own acceptance a moment later, her voice steadier than she felt, and the officiant nodded, satisfied, moving toward the final and most sacred part of the ceremony. The king will now see the face of his bride, as tradition demands, sealing the bond before all who bear witness. Draven reached toward her veil. Alira held perfectly still, every muscle tense with the awareness of hundreds of eyes upon her, of a moment that would define the rest of her life beginning in mere seconds. But before his fingers reached the lace, a sudden gust of wind tore through the great hall, sweeping in from some open door or window far behind the assembly, strong enough to make every torch flame bend sideways at once. The veil, loosely pinned after the long walk through drafty corridors, tore free from its clasps and lifted away from Alira's face entirely, carried several feet before it settled, forgotten, on the polished stone floor. For one suspended moment, no one moved, no one spoke. And then Alira watched, with growing confusion and alarm, as every trace of composure drained from Draven Ashwolf's face, replaced by something raw and unguarded and utterly stricken, an expression she was certain the entire watching court had never once seen their king wear in public. He stared at her, as though he were looking at a ghost. The silence in the great hall stretched so long that Alira began to wonder if the ceremony had simply stopped, if time itself had frozen the moment her veil hit the floor. Draven had not moved. His hand remained lifted where it had been, reaching for the lace that no longer existed, his golden eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to step backward, though pride kept her feet planted exactly where they stood. Around them, the assembled court had begun to murmur, a low wave of confused whispers rolling from the front rows toward the back of the hall, nobles leaning toward each other, pack elders exchanging sharp, searching glances. "My king?" the officiant asked quietly, her stone-grinding voice suddenly uncertain. Draven did not answer her. His gaze remained locked on Alira, moving slowly over her features, her eyes, the line of her jaw, as though he were cataloging every detail against some memory only he could see. Whatever he found there seemed to strike him like a physical blow, because his massive frame, always so composed, so controlled, actually swayed for a fraction of a second before he caught himself. "Draven," Kale's voice, low and urgent, cut through the murmuring crowd, as the advisor stepped closer to the dais, his own expression tight with concern. "My king, the court is watching." The words seemed to break whatever spell had gripped him. Draven blinked, and the raw, stricken look on his face vanished behind the familiar cold composure, so quickly that Alira might have imagined it entirely, except that her own pulse was still hammering from having witnessed it. "Continue the ceremony," Draven said, his voice rough, in a way it had not been moments before. The officiant, clearly shaken herself, fumbled to pick up the ritual words where she had left them, but the moment had already broken something in the room. Alira could feel hundreds of eyes on her now, not with the polite, distant curiosity of the day before, but with something sharper, more invasive, as though the entire court were trying to solve a puzzle she did not yet know existed. The ceremony finished. Vows were completed. Hands were bound with silver ribbon in the old northern tradition, and a horn sounded somewhere above the hall announcing to the fortress and the mountainside beyond that the king had taken a wife. But none of it felt real to Alira anymore. She moved through the rest of the ritual like someone walking through deep water, aware only of the strange, haunted way Draven kept glancing at her, then forcing his gaze away, then glancing back again as though he could not help himself. The feast that followed should have been a celebration. Long tables filled the great hall, laden with roasted meat and northern bread and wine dark as blood, and musicians in the gallery above played songs meant to honor the joining of two peoples. But Draven sat at the head table beside her in near total silence, his massive hands wrapped around a goblet he did not drink from, his jaw tight, his eyes distant, in a way that had nothing to do with the celebration around them. "You look as though you have seen a spirit," Alira finally said, quiet enough that only he could hear her over the music and conversation filling the hall. Draven's gaze snapped to her, startled, as though he had forgotten she could speak. That she was a person capable of noticing his distress, rather than simply an object placed beside him for the ceremony. "It is nothing," he said, though the words came out rougher than he clearly intended. "It did not look like nothing. The entire hall saw your face when my veil fell." His jaw worked, some internal battle playing out behind his eyes, and for a moment, Alira thought he might actually answer her honestly. Instead, he rose abruptly from the table, murmured something about pack business requiring his attention, and left the feast entirely, his massive frame cutting through the crowd toward the hall's side doors, while every eye in the room followed his departure, with barely concealed curiosity. Kale appeared at Alira's side almost immediately, his expression carefully neutral in the way she was beginning to recognize as his default state when dealing with anything uncomfortable. "He does not usually leave his own celebrations," Alira said, watching the door Draven had disappeared through. "No," Kale agreed. "He does not." "Kale." She turned to face him fully, done with careful, polite half-answers. "Who did he see when my veil fell? Because it was not me he was looking at. Not truly." Kale was quiet for a long moment, and Alira watched him weigh loyalty to his king against whatever honesty he owed her now, as the fortress's new lady. Finally he exhaled, glancing around to be sure no one else stood close enough to hear. "There was a woman," Kale said carefully, "many years ago. Before the war reached its worst years. Her name was Seraphine. She was pack-born, a warrior in her own right, and she and Draven were close, closer than most in the court ever fully understood." He paused. "She died protecting him during a border raid. It was not a quick death. He has not spoken her name aloud in years, not even to me, and I have known him since we were both boys running wild through these halls." Alira felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And I look like her." "I never met her myself," Kale admitted. "I was stationed elsewhere at the time of her death. But I have seen portraits in the old wing of the fortress, ones Draven does not know I have seen, because he had them removed from public halls years ago. The resemblance, my lady, is not subtle." The full weight of what had happened in the great hall settled over Alira like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders. She had not married a man who was simply cold and distant toward an obligation. She had married a man who had looked at her, in front of his entire court, and seen a ghost of a woman he had clearly never stopped grieving. "He thinks I am her," Alira said slowly, "or some echo of her." "I do not know what he thinks," Kale said. "I only know I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at you when that veil fell. Not with joy, not with love returned, with something closer to horror, my lady, as though the past itself had reached into this hall and refused to stay buried." The feast continued around them, laughter and music rolling on, as though nothing unusual had happened at all, as though the entire court had not just witnessed their king unravel in front of hundreds of witnesses. But Alira could feel the weight of curious glances still following her from every corner of the hall, could hear the whispers growing bolder now that Draven himself was no longer present to silence them with his presence alone. Helena found her sometime later, when the feast had begun to wind down, and exhausted guests were slowly drifting toward their own chambers. The pack elder settled into the seat Draven had vacated, studying Alira, with an expression far more thoughtful than the sharp assessment she had offered the day before. "You have had quite a wedding night already," Helena said, "and it has not even properly begun." "Who was she?" Alira asked directly, too tired and too unsettled for careful diplomacy. "Truly. Not the fortress rumors. Who was Seraphine to him?" Helena's expression softened, just slightly, the closest thing to sympathy Alira had seen from the old wolf. She was the woman this court expected him to marry, before the war took her instead. He was different before her death. Warmer, if you can believe that, of the man you saw on that throne yesterday. Something closed in him after she died, and it has stayed closed for 11 years. And now he has married a woman who wears her face. Not entirely her face, Helena corrected gently. Similar, yes. Striking, certainly. Enough to stop a king's heart in the middle of his own wedding. But you are not her, child. Whatever ghosts my king may be wrestling with tonight, that much I can already see plainly enough, even after only 2 days in your company. Alira looked toward the side door Draven had vanished through hours before, still closed, still hiding whatever grief or confusion he was working through alone in some corner of this vast, cold fortress that was now impossibly, her home. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to Helena. The old elder considered the question seriously before answering. "Now, I suspect, you discover exactly what kind of marriage you have entered, whether he can learn to see you as yourself, and not merely as the shadow of what he lost. That will determine everything else that follows. More than any treaty, any peace, any alliance our two councils negotiated. It always comes down to that in the end, does it not? Whether two people can truly see each other." Elira did not have an answer for that. She only knew, as she finally rose from the table and made her way toward the unfamiliar chambers that were now hers, that the marriage she had entered to end a war had already become something far more complicated than politics, and that the ghost of a dead woman named Seraphine now stood between her and whatever chance she might have had at building something real with the towering, haunted king she had bound herself to for life. Draven did not return to the private chambers he now technically shared with his new wife until well past midnight, and when Elira heard the heavy door finally open, she was still awake, sitting by the fire, with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the mountain chill. He stopped just inside the doorway when he saw her, clearly having expected her to be asleep, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The firelight caught the exhaustion in his face, the tightness around his eyes that suggested whatever battle he had fought with himself since leaving the feast had not been won cleanly. "You should be resting," he said finally, his voice rougher than the cold, commanding tone she had heard from him in the great hall. "I could not sleep," Elira answered. "Not after the ceremony. Not after watching my husband flee his own wedding feast, because my veil fell at the wrong moment." Something flickered across his face, guilt perhaps, or something close to it. He moved further into the room but kept a careful distance, settling into a chair on the opposite side of the fire, rather than approaching her directly. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "Kale already gave me one." She watched his jaw tighten at that, though he did not seem surprised. "Her name was Seraphine. She died protecting you, and apparently I resemble her closely enough to undo 11 years of careful composure in front of your entire court." Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire rather than at her. "I did not expect it," he said finally. "I was told very little about you before the wedding. Only your name, your father's position on the council, your age. No portraits were exchanged. I assumed, wrongly it seems, that this would be no different from any other political arrangement. And instead you found a ghost waiting at the altar." "You are not her," Draven said, sharper than he perhaps intended, though whether the sharpness was directed at Elira or at himself, she could not tell. "I know that. I knew it the moment the shock passed. But knowing something, and feeling it settle properly into your chest, are not always the same thing." Elira studied him across the firelight, this enormous, powerful king who had seemed so untouchable in the great hall, so cold and calculating, and saw instead someone still raw from a wound he had clearly never allowed to heal properly. "I did not ask to look like anyone," she said quietly. "I did not choose this face, and I will not spend my marriage being treated as a shadow of a woman I never met, however much you grieve her. I do not intend to treat you that way." "You already have," Elira said, standing now, unwilling to let the conversation soften into something gentler than the truth deserved. "You looked at me today and saw her, not me, her, and then you left, and every noble in that hall watched you leave, and every one of them is now wondering exactly what kind of woman you have brought into this fortress, and exactly how much of a substitute she is meant to be." Draven's expression hardened, though not with anger directed at her. "Then, I will make it clear to this court, and to you, that you are not a substitute for anyone. You are my wife. That is the only truth that matters now." "Words are easy," Elira said. "I will judge you by what follows them." Something in her tone, direct and unflinching, seemed to catch him off guard. He studied her with a different kind of attention than he had shown in the great hall, less like a man staring at a memory, and more like a man actually seeing the person standing in front of him for the first time. "You are not what I expected," he admitted slowly.
"Neither are you,"
Elira said. "I was told a Lycan king would be a fearsome, unfeeling creature who cared nothing for the human bride sent to his door. Instead, I find a man still mourning a woman, 11 years gone, unable to separate her memory from the stranger standing in front of him." Draven's massive shoulders dropped slightly, some of the careful armor he wore slipping, if only for a moment. Seraphine would not have wanted this, he said quietly. She would not have wanted her memory used as a wall between me and whoever I eventually married. She was not a woman who believed in wasted grief. Then perhaps you should honor her by not letting her memory become exactly that. The words landed harder than Alira intended, and she watched them strike something in him. Some old wound she had not meant to reopen so directly. But he did not argue with her. He simply nodded, slowly, as though accepting a truth he had avoided for 11 years. I will try, he said. That is the most honest promise I can offer you tonight. I do not know if I can separate the two of you cleanly, not after only one day, but I will try to see you as yourself. You deserve that much, whatever else this marriage is or is not. It was not the warm reassurance of a man falling instantly in love with his new bride. It was something more honest than that, an acknowledgement of difficulty, rather than a false promise of ease, and Alira found she respected it more than she would have respected empty comfort. Then we begin there, she said, honestly, or not at all. They did not speak much more that night. Draven retreated to a separate chamber adjoining the main bedroom. Giving her the space and privacy, neither of them was ready to surrender to the other, and Alira lay awake long after the fire burned low, turning over everything she had learned in a single overwhelming day. The morning brought new tensions before she had even risen from bed. Rosalind arrived with breakfast and news in equal measure, her expression grim as she set the tray down. The court is talking of nothing else, my lady. Some say the king's reaction proves you are meant to fail here, cursed somehow by wearing a dead woman's face. Others say it proves the opposite, that fate itself sent you to heal a wound that has festered in this fortress for over a decade. Alira asked, pushing herself upright. Rosalind hesitated. I believe the court will say whatever suits whichever faction is speaking, but I also believe I have never seen a king look so thoroughly shaken in front of his own people, not from what the older servants tell me. Whatever happened yesterday, it has cracked something open that many in this fortress thought permanently sealed. Alira dressed quickly, determined not to hide in her chambers, while rumors multiplied without her. She found Draven in the training yard below, already deep in discussion with several of his generals, his massive frame commanding the space even at rest, and she noted, with some satisfaction, that several nobles watching from the gallery above quickly straightened when they saw her approaching, rather than continuing their whispered conversations. My lady, one of the generals, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, bowed his head respectfully as she approached, though his eyes carried the same searching curiosity she had grown used to since arriving. Draven turned, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her, less guarded than it had been the day before, though still careful. You did not need to come down here. I wanted to see the fortress properly, Alira said. If I am to live here, I would rather understand it than hide from it. Something like approval crossed his face, quick and genuine. Then let me show you. He walked her through the training grounds himself, explaining the fortress defenses with a directness that surprised her, pointing out the watchtowers, the barracks, the deep armory carved into the mountain stone itself. Nobles and pack members alike watched their king walk beside his new wife, with an attentiveness he had shown no one in years, and Alira could feel the court's assessment of her shifting minute by minute, curiosity slowly bending towards something closer to cautious respect. But even as the morning passed and the tension between them eased into something almost companionable, Alira could not shake the memory of his face when her veil fell, the raw grief he had not been able to hide from an entire watching court. Whatever honesty they had built between them overnight, she understood now that the true test of this marriage would not be whether Draven could learn to treat her kindly. It would be whether he could ever truly stop seeing Seraphine's ghost every time he looked at his new wife's face. 3 weeks into the marriage, Alira had learned the shape of the fortress better than she had learned the shape of her own husband. She knew which corridors caught the morning light and which stayed cold and shadowed even at midday. She knew the cooks by name, knew that the youngest kitchen girl, a nervous pack child named Wren, flinched whenever a noble raised their voice, and had taken to speaking gently to her whenever their paths crossed. She knew the guards who patrolled the east wall preferred quiet nods to formal greetings, and the ones on the west wall liked to be asked about their families. What she did not know, still, was how to reach the man she had married. Draven kept his distance in ways that felt deliberate rather than simply cold. He was never cruel to her, never dismissive in the way she had feared during that first terrible day in the Great Hall. He asked after her well-being at meals, ensured she had everything she required, even defended her once, sharply, when a visiting noble made a thinly veiled comment about human brides lacking the strength for northern winters. But he never lingered, never sought her out beyond what duty required, never looked at her the way a husband might look at a wife he was building something with. It was Kale who finally gave her a way to understand the pattern, though he had not meant to. "He is protecting himself," Kale said one afternoon, when Alira found him reviewing supply reports in the fortress library and asked, bluntly, why the king kept such careful distance from his own wife. "Every time he draws closer to you, he tells himself, it is not you he wants closer, but her. He does not trust the feeling, so he refuses to act on it at all. That is not protection," Alira said. "That is punishment, for both of us." Kale had no answer for that, only a tired, sympathetic look that told her he agreed but had no power to change his king's mind. So Alira decided she would have to change it herself, not through grand gestures or confrontations, but through the same quiet persistence that had already won her the trust of the kitchen staff and the guards along the walls. If Draven would not seek her out, she would make herself impossible to overlook. She began attending his council meetings, seated quietly at the edge of the room at first, simply observing, until her sharp questions about supply lines and border patrols made even the gruffest generals begin addressing their reports partly to her. She began walking the training yard in the mornings, not to watch Draven specifically, but because she found she enjoyed the discipline and focus of the warriors practicing there, and slowly, warriors who had once eyed her with wary curiosity began greeting her by name. It was during one of these mornings that she first saw Draven's control slip in a way that had nothing to do with grief. A young pack warrior, barely more than a boy, had been struggling through a defensive drill against an older, more experienced opponent, growing increasingly frustrated with each failed attempt. Rather than watching in silence as she expected any king to do, Draven stepped down from the raised platform where he had been observing, moved to stand beside the frustrated boy, and demonstrated the correct stance himself, his voice patient and encouraging in a way Alira had not yet heard him use with anyone. "Again," Draven said, stepping back. "You are thinking with your fear instead of your training. Trust what your body already knows." The boy tried again, and this time succeeded, disarming his opponent with a clean, controlled movement, and Draven's face broke into something Alira had not yet seen from him. Not the small, careful half-smiles she had occasionally caught at dinner, a real smile, unguarded and warm, proud in a way that transformed his entire face. She found herself staring, caught off guard by how thoroughly that single expression changed him, how much younger and less burdened he looked in that unguarded moment. He noticed her watching. The smile did not vanish entirely, but it shifted, became more careful, more aware of being observed, and Alira understood in that instant exactly how much effort it cost him to maintain his usual composure, how rarely he allowed himself even small moments of unguarded warmth. "You are good with them," she said, once he had rejoined her at the edge of the yard. "They remind me why any of this matters," Draven said. "The war took most of my own generation before their time. These young ones deserve better than we were given. And yet you keep the same distance from your own wife that you refuse to keep from a nervous young recruit." His jaw tightened, but he did not deflect the observation the way she expected him to. "That is different. Is it? Or is it simply easier to be kind to someone who does not remind you of a woman you buried 11 years ago?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, watching the training yard rather than her, though she suspected he was not truly seeing the warriors practicing in front of him at all. "I do not know how to separate the two of you cleanly," he admitted finally, echoing the honesty he had offered on their wedding night. "Every time I look at you for too long, some part of me braces for the grief to return. It is easier to keep distance than to constantly fight that feeling." "Then stop fighting it as though it is something shameful," Alira said. "Let yourself see me. Truly see me. I am not asking you to forget her. I am asking you to stop letting her memory decide how you treat me." He looked at her then, properly, the way he had looked at the boy in the training yard, patient and attentive, and for the first time since the wedding, Alira felt something shift genuinely between them, some small crack forming in the careful wall he had built. "Tell me something about yourself," Draven said suddenly. "Not about the council, not about the treaty, something true, something only you would know." Alira considered the request carefully. surprised by the sincerity behind it. "I hate the color gold," she said finally. "Every noble in my father's court wears it, because it signals wealth, and I have always found it garish. I much prefer the deep blue of a winter sky, just before the stars appear." Something in Draven's expression softened further. "Seraphine loved gold," he said quietly. "She wore it whenever the occasion allowed." Elira felt her chest tighten, bracing for the familiar shadow to fall over the moment again. But instead, Draven continued, his voice steady. "You are not her," he said, as much to himself as to Elira. "I am beginning to understand that properly now. Not just as a fact I know, but as something I feel. Thank you for the blue sky. I will remember that. About you specifically. It was a small thing, barely more than a passing exchange in a busy training yard." But Elira understood, walking back toward the fortress beside her husband, in a silence that felt, for the first time, comfortable, rather than strained, that something important had shifted between them. Not everything. Not enough to undo 11 years of grief in a single conversation, but enough to prove that the wall between them was not as immovable as either of them had assumed. That evening, for the first time since the wedding, Draven joined her for the entire dinner, rather than retreating early to council business, and their conversation stretched long past the meal's end, covering everything from her childhood in her father's household to his own memories of growing up as the pack's heir, learning to fight before he learned to read, watching his own father struggle to hold the pack together during the war's darkest years. It was not romance, not yet, not in the way stories spoke of it, but it was honesty, freely given on both sides, and Elira found herself thinking, as she finally retired to her chambers that night, that perhaps a marriage built on honesty first, and affection second, might prove sturdier than one built the other way around. She did not yet know how quickly that fragile foundation would be tested, or how soon the same enemies who had sent arrows to the forest road and a starving wolf into the fortress corridors would strike again, this time aiming not at the treaty itself, but directly at her. The warmth that had begun growing between Elira and Draven did not go unnoticed by the fortress, and not everyone welcomed it. Elira first sensed the shift in a noble named Corwin, a broad-faced Lycan lord whose family had grown wealthy supplying weapons to the pack armies during the long years of war. He had always been polite to her in passing, distantly courteous in the way most nobles were, but as autumn deepened and word spread through the court that the king had begun spending genuine time with his human wife, Corwin's politeness curdled into something colder. She noticed him watching her too closely during council sessions, noticed the way he steered conversations toward questions of succession and pack purity whenever she was present, subtle enough to avoid direct offense, but pointed enough that she understood the message clearly. A human wife bearing the pack's future heirs was not a future every noble in this fortress welcomed, however necessary the treaty had been. "He lost 2 brothers to the border war," Cale explained, when Elira finally asked him directly about Corwin's shifting demeanor. "His family profited from the fighting, yes, but he also buried people he loved because of it. Peace does not erase that grief for him. If anything, watching the king grow close to the very symbol of that peace seems to remind him of exactly what the war cost his family." "Grief does not excuse hostility," Elira said. "No," Cale agreed, "but it explains it. Watch him carefully, my lady. Grief that curdles into resentment can become dangerous, especially in a man with Corwin's resources and standing." Elira took the warning seriously, though she did not yet understand how quickly it would prove necessary. The attack came on a cold evening, nearly a month after the wedding, during a rare moment when Elira had ventured into the fortress gardens alone, seeking quiet air after a long day of council sessions that had left her head aching with politics and half-veiled threats disguised as diplomatic conversation. She did not hear the attacker approach. The gardens were quiet, moonlit, the last of autumn's flowers withering in the cold, and she was examining a stubborn cluster of frost-touched roses when a hand closed roughly over her mouth from behind, and a blade pressed cold against her throat. Not a sound. A low voice hissed against her ear, human by the roughness of the accent, though she could not place which faction he might belong to. "You end this peace, or I end you. The choice is yours." Every instinct screamed to fight, but the blade at her throat demanded stillness first, careful thought before action. Elira forced herself to breathe slowly, to think past the terror clawing at her chest, and remembered, suddenly and clearly, a lesson her father had drilled into her since childhood. A cornered opponent who believes they have already won grows careless. She let her body go slightly limp, feigning the beginning of a feint, and felt the attacker's grip shift to compensate, the blade easing a fraction away from her throat as he adjusted his hold. In that fraction of released pressure, Elira drove her elbow backward with every ounce of strength she possessed, striking him hard enough in the ribs to force a grunt of pain and a stumbling step back. She ran, screaming now, no longer needing silence, sprinting across the frozen garden path toward the fortress lights, while footsteps pounded close behind her. She did not need to run far. A deep, furious roar tore through the night air, and something enormous crashed through the garden hedges to her left, moving faster than anything of that size should have been capable of moving. Draven, still in his formal council robes, had abandoned every trace of composed royal dignity, his eyes blazing gold in the darkness, his entire massive frame radiating a barely restrained violence that made even Elira's racing heart stutter with something close to awe. He reached the attacker before the man could flee, and though Elira did not see exactly what happened in the chaos of the following moments, she heard the sounds of a brief, brutal struggle, followed by silence, followed by Draven's voice, rough and shaking with an emotion she had never heard from him before, calling her name across the garden. "Elira." "I am here," she called back, her own voice shaking as badly as his. "I am not hurt." He reached her in seconds, his massive hands gentle, despite their obvious strength, checking her face, her throat, her arms, for any sign of injury, with a desperate thoroughness that told her exactly how deeply the attack had shaken him. "He had a blade to your throat," Draven said, his voice raw. "I felt it. I felt the moment he threatened you, even from the council hall 3 floors above. I do not know how, but I felt it." Elira did not fully understand what he meant, not then, though she would come to learn later that a true pack bond between mates carried threads of awareness that defied simple explanation, threads that had apparently already begun forming between them, despite the careful distance Draven had tried to maintain. "Who was he?" she asked, once her breathing had steadied enough to speak clearly. Draven's expression darkened, alive, for now, though barely conscious. He will answer every question the interrogators put to him before this night ends. The interrogation, conducted in the fortress's lower chambers by Kale and 2 of Draven's most trusted generals, revealed a name that made the blood drain from Elira's face when she finally heard it the following morning. Corwin. The attacker, a mercenary hired through 3 separate intermediaries to disguise the true source of the coin, had confessed under careful, methodical questioning that his payment had come from Corwin's household, funneled through a merchant contact who dealt in northern weapons and, apparently, less honorable services as well. "He wanted the alliance broken," Kale reported grimly, standing before Draven and Elira in the private council chamber, where the king had gathered his most trusted advisors at dawn. "Your death, my lady, would have been blamed on human treachery, reigniting the war his family profited from, for 3 generations. He believed, I suspect, that he was protecting the pack's future by destroying yours." Draven's expression had gone cold in a way Elira had not seen since her arrival, a controlled fury that seemed far more dangerous than any open display of rage could have been. "Bring him before the full council," Draven said. "Let every noble in this fortress see exactly what becomes of those who move against my wife. My king." Kale's voice carried careful warning. "Corwin has powerful allies among the older families. A public execution risks fracturing the pack's internal unity, at precisely the moment we can least afford division." "Then we will proceed carefully," Draven said, though the fury in his eyes did not lessen. "But he will answer for this, fully. Whatever allies he believes will protect him." Elira, listening to the exchange, felt a strange, unexpected clarity settle over her fear. This was not merely a political crisis to be managed. This was an attempt on her life, orchestrated by a noble within her own new home, and the fact that Draven's fury on her behalf burned this hot, this immediate, told her something important about how far their fragile, honest connection had already grown. "I want to speak with Corwin myself," Elira said, surprising everyone in the chamber, including herself. "Absolutely not," Draven said immediately. "He tried to have me killed, to protect a version of peace, built on continued suspicion between our peoples," Elira said firmly. "I would understand why, from his own mouth, before any judgment is passed. Not because I forgive him, because understanding him may help prevent the next noble who feels similarly from making the same choice. Draven studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her from further danger and a growing respect for her judgment that had been building steadily since their conversation in the training yard weeks before. "Under heavy guard," he said finally, "and I will be present throughout." The meeting, when it finally happened later that day, in a heavily guarded lower chamber, proved as difficult as Alira had expected. Corwin, stripped of his usual noble finery and bound at the wrists, regarded her with a mixture of hatred and something close to grief that reminded her uncomfortably of Kale's earlier explanation. "You do not understand what your peace costs men like me," Corwin said bitterly, when she asked him directly why he had chosen violence over acceptance. "My brothers died fighting your people. Now I am told to smile and welcome a human bride into the fortress that should have been theirs to inherit, to see her children raised as heirs to a pack they never truly belonged to." "The children of this marriage will belong to this pack fully," Alira said steadily, "as will I, in time, whether you accept it or not. But killing me would not have returned your brothers to you. It would only have ensured other families buried sons in the fighting that followed." Corwin had no answer for that, only a bitter, defeated silence that told her the confrontation, however necessary, had changed nothing in his heart. But as she left the chamber afterward, walking beside Draven through the cold fortress corridors, she understood that the true danger had not been fully addressed. Corwin's arrest would satisfy justice, but it would not erase the resentment simmering among other nobles who shared his grief, his suspicion, his quiet belief that this peace had been built on a foundation none of them had truly chosen. The war between their peoples might have ended on paper, but Alira understood now, walking through halls that had nearly become the site of her murder, that the true fight for lasting peace had only just begun, and it would require far more than a single arrest to secure it fully. Corwin's trial, held 3 days later, before the full assembled council, did not go as smoothly as Draven had hoped. The noble stood before the gathered court, still defiant despite his bound wrists, and rather than accepting judgment quietly, he used his final public moments to accuse the crown of weakness, of allowing a human bride to soften a pack that had once been feared across every border in the north. "You would rather protect her than protect the strength this pack was built on," Corwin shouted, as guards moved to silence him. "Others agree with me. I am not alone in this." The words landed like a struck match in dry grass. Alira watched the assembled nobles carefully as Corwin spoke, noting which faces remained impassive and which flickered with something closer to agreement, cataloging every reaction the way her father had taught her to read a room full of politicians during tense council sessions back home. Draven's judgment, when it came, was swift and absolute. Corwin would lose his lands, his title, and his standing within the pack, exiled from the northern territories entirely, though Draven stopped short of the execution some of his generals had quietly urged. "Killing him makes a martyr of a fool," Draven told Alira privately afterward, his exhaustion evident in the tight lines around his eyes. "Exile removes his influence without giving his sympathizers a rallying cry." "You think there are more of them," Alira said. It was not a question. "I know there are more of them," Draven admitted grimly. Corwin was never clever enough to plan 2 separate attacks on his own. The forest road ambush, the wolf smuggled into the fortress corridors, and now this. Someone helped him. Someone with resources beyond his own household, and that someone is still walking free within these walls. The investigation that followed consumed the fortress for weeks. Kale led the effort personally, questioning household staff, tracing coin trails through merchant contacts, cross-referencing travel records against the timing of each attack. Alira, unable to simply wait passively while her own life remained under threat, threw herself into the effort as well, using the trust she had built with kitchen staff and guards to gather information the formal investigation might otherwise miss. It was Wren, the nervous young kitchen girl Alira had befriended in her early weeks at the fortress, who finally provided the thread that unraveled everything. "My lady," Wren said one evening, finding Alira alone in the fortress library, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty room around them. "I overheard something. I do not know if it matters, but it frightened me enough that I could not stay silent." "Tell me," Illyra said gently, recognizing the girl's courage in coming forward at all. 2 nights ago, I was delivering supplies to the lower storage halls, and I heard voices through a side passage. Lord Corwin's steward, the one who was arrested alongside him, was speaking with someone. A woman's voice, my lady, one I did not recognize, though she spoke with the accent of the southern human territories, not our own northern tongue. Illyra's pulse quickened. What did they say? The steward called her by a name, Genevieve. She told him the plan had not failed entirely, that the true purpose had never been Corwin's success, only creating enough chaos to weaken trust in the alliance itself. She said something about a bloodline, my lady, though I did not understand the meaning. She said the king's reaction at the wedding had confirmed exactly what they suspected. The name meant nothing to Illyra, but the mention of the bloodline, connected directly to Draven's reaction when her veil had fallen, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold fortress air. She brought the information immediately to Draven and Cale, and watched both men's expressions shift from focused concern to something far more alarmed, as she repeated Ren's account. Genevieve, Cale repeated slowly, exchanging a grim look with Draven. My king, that name belongs to a faction we have not heard from in years. The Voss opposition, human nobles who believed the old treaties negotiated after the border wars, gave away too much southern territory. They went quiet after their leadership was scattered nearly a decade ago. But if they have resurfaced now, connected somehow to your reaction at the wedding. What bloodline could they possibly mean? Illyra asked, though something in Draven's suddenly pale expression suggested he already had a theory forming. Seraphine's family, Draven said slowly, was never fully human, nor fully packborn. Her mother came from a lineage that predated the current treaties entirely, a bloodline believed extinct after the worst years of the border conflicts. If that bloodline somehow survived, hidden among human families for a generation, and if you happen to carry some trace of it, that would explain the resemblance, Cale finished quietly. Not coincidence, blood. Illyra felt the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath her feet. You are suggesting I am somehow related to her, to Seraphine. It would explain a great deal, Draven said, his voice careful now, watching her reaction closely. The resemblance strong enough to shake me at our wedding. The specific targeting by a faction connected to bloodlines older than the current treaties. Someone believes you carry blood they consider dangerous, powerful enough to be worth killing you over, rather than risk it reasserting itself within this pack's future line of succession. The implications settled over Illyra slowly, each piece clicking into place with unsettling clarity. Her father had never spoken of distant relatives beyond his immediate household. Her mother, who had died when Illyra was young, had come from a minor southern family with little notable history that anyone had ever mentioned to her. But minor families sometimes hid significant secrets, especially in the aftermath of wars that had scattered bloodlines across borders and buried inconvenient truths beneath decades of careful silence. We need my father, Illyra said finally. If anyone knows the truth of my mother's lineage, it would be him. A messenger was dispatched south within the hour, carrying an urgent summons for Nathaniel Voss to travel to the fortress immediately, along with careful instructions ensuring his journey would receive full pack escort protection, given the clear danger now surrounding anything connected to Illyra's bloodline. While they waited for her father's arrival, the investigation into Genevieve and the resurfaced opposition faction intensified. Cale's people traced merchant contacts, questioned informants along the southern trade routes, and slowly began assembling a picture of an organization far more extensive and dangerous than anyone had initially suspected, one that had been patiently rebuilding influence for years, waiting for precisely this kind of opportunity to fracture the fragile peace between human and pack territories. They do not simply want the marriage ended, Cale reported grimly, during a tense council session held a week after Ren's revelation. They want the bloodline itself eliminated, believing its resurfacing threatens the current balance of power on both sides of the border. If Illyra does carry Seraphine's lineage, and if that lineage carries the significance the old treaties once assigned it, then eliminating her becomes, in their eyes, a matter of preserving the entire Northern Order. What significance did the old treaties assign to this bloodline? Illyra asked, unsettled by how thoroughly her own life had become entangled with politics and history she had never known existed until a few short weeks ago. Draven's expression carried a weight she had not seen from him since the wedding itself. The bloodline was said to carry an old pack gift, nearly lost to time even before the worst of the border wars. Those who carried it were believed capable of forming bonds between human and pack blood more deeply than any ordinary marriage could achieve, uniting both natures within a single lineage, rather than simply joining two separate peoples through treaty alone. "You are saying I might carry something more than a simple resemblance," Illyra said slowly. "Something that could actually change the nature of this alliance." "I am saying," Draven said carefully, "that whoever ordered these attacks against you clearly believes exactly that, strongly enough to risk open conflict rather than allow you to remain safely at my side. And I am saying that until your father arrives and we understand the truth fully, every guard in this fortress will remain doubled around you, day and night, without exception." Illyra nodded, understanding the necessity even as the weight of it settled uncomfortably over her shoulders. She had come to this fortress believing her role was simple, a treaty bride, a symbol of peace between two exhausted peoples. Now she understood that her very existence might carry a significance far older and far more dangerous than any single marriage, significance that powerful, patient enemies were willing to kill her over, rather than risk seeing fulfilled. Whatever answers her father brought with him, Illyra understood that the quiet, careful trust she had begun building with Draven over the past month was about to be tested by forces far larger than either of them. Forces rooted in history neither of them had chosen, and neither of them could fully control. Nathaniel Voss arrived at the fortress 12 days later, escorted by a full pack guard through mountain passes already thickening with early snow, and Illyra had never been more relieved to see her father's tired, familiar face. He embraced her in the courtyard, without regard for the watching nobles, his hands gripping her shoulders as he studied her for any sign of injury, and when he finally released her, his expression carried a gravity she rarely saw from him, even during his most difficult council negotiations. "The message said you were in danger," Nathaniel said, glancing toward Draven, who stood a respectful distance away, allowing father and daughter their reunion. "It did not explain why an old bloodline from your mother's family might be the cause." They gathered that evening in Draven's private council chamber, away from the wider court, where Kale laid out everything the investigation had uncovered: the resurfaced Genevieve faction, their apparent belief that Illyra carried Seraphine's ancient lineage, and the 2 attempts already made on her life as a result. Nathaniel listened in silence, his face growing paler with each detail, until finally he exhaled a long, heavy breath and admitted a truth he had clearly carried alone for many years. "Your mother," he said quietly, looking at Illyra, "came from a family that changed its name 3 generations before her birth, fleeing persecution during the earliest years of the border conflicts. I learned the truth only after we married, when her own mother, dying, finally told me the full history on her deathbed. The family had once been known by a different name entirely, one connected to the old bloodline the pack elders spoke of in their oldest histories." "Why did you never tell me?" Illyra asked, though the question came without anger, only exhausted confusion. "Because your mother made me promise," Nathaniel said, his voice heavy with old grief. "She feared exactly this. That if the truth ever surfaced, it would make you a target for those who still believed the old bloodline carried dangerous power. Power that threatened whatever fragile order existed between human and pack territories at any given time. She wanted you to grow up safely, without that shadow following you before you were even old enough to understand it. And now the shadow has found me regardless," Illyra said quietly. Draven, who had listened to the entire exchange with careful attention, finally spoke. "Elder Helena has studied the old pack histories more thoroughly than anyone else in this fortress. If the bloodline's true nature can be confirmed or understood more fully, she is the one who can help us understand what we are truly facing." Helena was summoned immediately, and the elder arrived within the hour, her expression grave as she listened to Nathaniel's account of Illyra's maternal lineage. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her sharp eyes studying Illyra with an intensity that made the younger woman feel, once again, like she was being carefully measured against some ancient standard. "The bloodline you describe," Helena said finally, "was never a curse, whatever fearful faction believes otherwise. It was considered, in the oldest histories our pack keeps, a rare gift. Those who carried it were said to walk fully between both natures, human and pack, without the division most crossbred unions still carry even generations later. A true bridge between our peoples, not merely a symbolic one. Then why would anyone wish to eliminate it?" Elira asked. Fear, Helena said simply. Those who benefit from division between our peoples, whether through trade in weapons or through political power built on old grievances, have every reason to fear a bloodline capable of erasing that division entirely. If the old gift resurfaces fully within you, and within any children you might bear the king, the divide between human and pack blood could begin closing in truth, not merely on paper. That threatens fortunes built on keeping the wound open. The weight of the revelation settled over the chamber slowly. Elira was not simply a treaty bride anymore, not merely a woman who happened to resemble a beloved dead warrior. She was, potentially, the living answer to exactly the kind of lasting peace the old bloodline had once represented, and that made her infinitely more valuable to protect, and infinitely more dangerous to those determined to keep the war's old wounds bleeding for their own benefit. Genevieve's faction will not stop with failed attempts, Cale said grimly. If anything, confirmation of the bloodline's truth will only intensify their determination to eliminate the threat they believe Elira represents. Then we do not wait for them to strike again, Draven said, his voice carrying the same cold, controlled fury Elira had heard the night of the garden attack. We find them first. Cale, use every resource this fortress commands. Nathaniel, your council contacts in the south may help trace Genevieve's movements through territory the pack cannot easily monitor. Between us, we will find this faction before they find another opportunity to strike. The following days passed in a tense flurry of coordinated investigation, human and pack resources working together more closely than they had in years, driven by the shared urgency of protecting Elira and, by extension, the fragile peace her marriage represented. Nathaniel's council contacts identified a merchant network along the southern border that had been quietly funding Genevieve's faction for years, disguised as ordinary trade in northern furs and southern grain. Cale's own investigators, meanwhile, traced the mercenary who had attacked Elira in the garden back to a training camp hidden in the disputed borderlands, a camp that appeared to be housing far more than a single hired blade. It is an army, Cale reported grimly, once the full picture finally emerged. Small, still, but growing. Genevieve has spent years quietly recruiting disillusioned soldiers from both sides of the old conflict, men and women who never fully accepted the peace, and believe restarting the war serves their interests better than living beneath it. And they believe eliminating me will restart it, Elira said. They believe eliminating you removes the strongest symbol of lasting peace this alliance has produced, Draven corrected. Whether the bloodline's power is real, or simply believed to be real, by those determined to see it as a threat, the effect on their plans would be the same either way. Elira felt the full weight of what she now represented settle over her, heavier than any crown, heavier than any treaty her father had negotiated years before her involvement began. She had come to this fortress believing she was simply ending a war through marriage. Now she understood she might be the key to ending it far more permanently than any of them had originally imagined, and that understanding made her both a target and, potentially, exactly what these lands needed most. That night, alone with Draven, in their shared chambers for the first time since her father's arrival, Elira finally allowed herself to voice the fear she had been carrying silently since Helena's revelation. What if it is not enough? She asked quietly. What if this bloodline, whatever power it truly carries, cannot actually heal what generations of war have broken? What if I am simply a target, without ever becoming the bridge everyone now expects me to be? Draven was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that held none of the cold calculation from their first meeting, only genuine, unguarded concern. You already are a bridge, he said finally, not because of any old bloodline, or any ancient gift the histories describe, because of who you have chosen to be since arriving here. You learned the names of kitchen staff, who most nobles never notice. You stood before the man who tried to have you killed, and sought to understand him, rather than simply condemn him. You have built trust in this fortress, through your own choices, Elira, not through blood, inherited from a woman who died before you were even born. The words settled over her like warmth after a long cold, and for the first time since Ren's frightened revelation in the library, Elira felt something steadier than fear take root in her chest. Then we fight for that, she said. Not for a bloodline, for what we have actually built, choice by choice, since the day I arrived. Draven reached for her hand, his massive fingers wrapping gently around hers, and this time, when their eyes met, Alira saw no ghost looking back at her. She saw only Draven, fully present, fully hers, ready to fight alongside her for a peace built on something far sturdier than ancient prophecy. "Then we fight together," he said. "Whatever Genevieve's faction believes they are facing, they have vastly underestimated what this alliance has already become." The final confrontation with Genevieve's faction came sooner than anyone expected, forced not by careful investigation, but by the faction's own growing desperation. A message arrived at the fortress gates one bitter morning, delivered by a frightened courier who claimed he had been paid only to deliver it and knew nothing of its contents. Draven read it in the great hall, surrounded by his generals and council, his expression darkening with each line. "They have taken hostages," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury. "A border village 3 days' ride south, one that supplies grain to both human and pack territories alike. Genevieve claims she will burn it to the ground unless Alira is delivered to her personally, alone, within 5 days." The chamber erupted into immediate argument. Generals demanded an immediate military response, storming the training camp Kale's investigators had already located. Nathaniel, pale with fear for his daughter, insisted the demand was a trap designed purely to lure Alira into a vulnerable position where she could finally be eliminated. Kale argued for a more careful approach, gathering additional intelligence before committing to any single course of action that might endanger both Alira and the hostage village simultaneously. Alira, standing quietly at the edge of the chamber, listened to every argument before finally speaking, her voice cutting through the chaos with a calm certainty that surprised even herself. "I will go." The room fell silent. Draven turned to her, his expression a mixture of fury and fear that made his massive frame seem to vibrate with restrained tension. "Absolutely not," he said. "This is precisely the trap Nathaniel described. Genevieve does not want a hostage exchange. She wants you delivered into her hands where no pack guard can protect you." "Then we do not let her have what she wants," Alira said steadily. "I will go, but not alone, and not into a trap of her choosing entirely. We use her own demand against her." Over the following tense hours, a plan began to take shape, built on careful coordination between human and pack forces working together more seamlessly than at any point since the treaty's original signing. Alira would travel toward the meeting point, as Genevieve demanded, but pack warriors, disguised among the traveling party as ordinary guards and servants, would accompany her far closer than any outside observer would suspect. Kale's forces, meanwhile, would move quietly toward the hostage village itself, under cover of night, positioned to strike the moment Genevieve's attention was fully occupied with the exchange. "If anything goes wrong," Draven said, gripping Alira's shoulders with a desperate intensity the night before their departure, "if there is any sign this plan is unraveling, you run, immediately. Do not wait to see how the situation develops. Do not try to be clever. Run, and trust that we will reach you." "I trust you," Alira said simply. "That is not a small thing for me to say, considering how this marriage began." Something shifted in Draven's expression, raw and vulnerable in a way she had rarely seen from him even in their most honest private conversations. "I have spent 11 years afraid of losing someone I loved to this war," he said quietly. "I will not survive losing you the same way. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you stopped being Seraphine's shadow in my eyes a long time ago. You are simply, entirely, Alira, and I love you for exactly that." The words, spoken plainly, without the careful diplomatic distance that had once defined every exchange between them, settled over Alira, with a warmth that steadied her more thoroughly than any battle plan could have managed. "Then let us finish this together," she said, "so we can build whatever comes after it properly, without Genevieve's shadow hanging over every day we have left." The journey south passed in tense, watchful silence, the traveling party moving carefully through mountain passes already deep in early winter snow. Alira rode at the center of the group, flanked by warriors disguised as ordinary attendants, every sense straining for any sign of ambush along the narrow forest roads. Genevieve's chosen meeting point proved to be a clearing, deep within contested borderland territory, neither fully human nor fully pack-controlled, chosen precisely for its isolation. Alira approached alone, as instructed, though she knew pack warriors moved silently through the surrounding tree line, close enough to intervene the moment circumstances required it. Genevieve herself proved smaller than Alira had expected, a sharp-featured woman with cold eyes, and the bearing of someone who had spent years commanding loyalty through fear, rather than genuine respect. "You came," Genevieve said, studying Alira with open curiosity, braver than I expected from a treaty bride. "Release the village hostages," Alira said, refusing to be drawn into idle conversation. "That was the agreement." "The agreement," Genevieve said slowly, circling Alira with predatory patience, "was that you would come alone, to face what your bloodline has cost this land for generations." "My bloodline has cost nothing," Alira said firmly. "The war cost everything, fought by people on both sides who believed peace was impossible. I am simply trying to prove them wrong." "You are trying to erase a divide that keeps both our peoples honest with each other," Genevieve snapped, her composure finally cracking. "Blend our blood too closely, and what remains to prevent either side from simply absorbing the other entirely? What remains of what makes us who we are?" "Perhaps something stronger than either side alone," Alira said. "Perhaps that terrifies you more than any war ever could." Genevieve's hand moved toward the blade at her waist, and in that same instant, the surrounding tree line erupted into sudden motion. Pack warriors surged from hidden positions. Kale's forces struck simultaneously at the hostage village 3 days south, according to the carefully coordinated timing, and within minutes, Genevieve's small guard found themselves overwhelmed, disarmed, and bound before the woman herself could complete whatever final act of violence she had intended. Draven arrived moments later, having refused to remain safely behind at the fortress, despite every argument from his generals, his massive frame moving through the chaos, with the same fierce protectiveness Alira had witnessed during the garden attack months before. "Alira!" He reached her within seconds, his hands checking her for injury with the same desperate thoroughness as before. "I am unharmed," she assured him, watching Genevieve being dragged away in bound restraints, the woman's furious eyes still fixed on Alira with undimmed hatred. "It is over." Word arrived within the hour that the hostage village had been secured without casualties, Kale's forces striking with precision, the moment Genevieve's attention had been fully occupied by the confrontation in the clearing. The faction's leadership, scattered and captured across both locations simultaneously, would face justice through the same careful, measured process that had already dealt with Corwin months before. But as Alira stood in the snow-covered clearing, watching the last of Genevieve's forces being marched away under guard, she understood that the true victory was not simply the faction's defeat. It was standing here, beside Draven, having chosen to face this danger together, rather than letting fear or old grief keep them divided any longer. "You called me Alira," she said quietly, once the chaos had finally settled and they stood alone for a rare, quiet moment. "Not the bloodline, not a symbol, just Alira. That is all you have ever needed to be," Draven said, pulling her gently into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any formal vow ever could. "I am only sorry it took this long for me to fully understand that myself." They rode back toward the fortress the following morning, the immediate danger finally behind them, though the harder work of healing generations of division still lay ahead. But for the first time since arriving at that cold mountain fortress months before, Alira felt certain the marriage she had entered for the sake of peace had become something far more valuable than any treaty alone could have produced. It had become a partnership, built on honesty, chosen freely, strong enough to withstand whatever history or enemies still waited to test it. Spring arrived in the northern territories, slower than in the south, but when it finally came, it transformed the fortress in ways Alira could not have imagined during her first cold, uncertain weeks there. Snow melted from the mountain slopes, revealing hardy wildflowers along the training yard walls that the youngest pack children delighted in gathering, and the entire fortress seemed to exhale after a long, tense winter that had tested it more thoroughly than any season in recent memory. Genevieve's trial had concluded months earlier, her faction fully dismantled, its remaining leadership scattered or imprisoned across both human and pack territories, in a coordinated effort that had, if anything, strengthened cooperation between the two peoples, rather than weakening it. Corwin's exile, too, had produced an unexpected outcome. Word reached the fortress that spring that the disgraced noble, stripped of his lands and title, had settled quietly in a southern border town, working alongside human farmers rebuilding fields damaged during the war's final years. Whether genuine remorse or simple necessity drove the change, Alira could not say for certain, but she found herself hoping, quietly, that even those who had once wished her harm might find their own path toward the peace this marriage represented. The court itself had changed most visibly of all. Nobles who had once watched Illyra with wary curiosity now sought her counsel directly on matters touching both human and pack interests, recognizing in her a genuine bridge between the two peoples, rather than merely a political symbol imposed upon them by treaty. Helena, the sharp-eyed elder who had first assessed her so critically in the courtyard, had become something closer to a trusted mentor, teaching Illyra the old pack histories and traditions, with a patience that suggested genuine affection rather than simple duty. "You have done what I did not believe possible," Helena told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the fortress gardens, where the assassination attempt had occurred nearly a year before, now blooming instead with the season's first roses. "You have made this court believe in the peace it fought so long to achieve, not merely accept it." "I did not do it alone," Illyra said, watching Draven across the training yard, patiently guiding a new group of young recruits through the same drills she had first seen him teaching the boy, who had struggled so many months before. "None of this would have held without him standing beside me." "No," Helena agreed, a rare warmth in her weathered face. "It would not have. 11 years I watched that man carry grief like armor, refusing to let anyone close enough to help him set it down. You did what none of us could manage in all that time." Draven noticed them watching, and made his way over. His expression relaxed in a way that had become increasingly common over the recent months. The careful, guarded King Illyra had first met in the Great Hall, now largely replaced by someone who had finally allowed himself to be fully present in his own life again. "The Southern Council has sent word," he said, once Helena had excused herself to continue the training session in his absence. "Your father wishes to visit again this summer, and has asked whether the fortress might host a gathering between human and pack families, an actual celebration rather than simply another round of careful treaty negotiations." "What did you tell him?" Illyra asked. "That I could think of nothing this fortress needs more," Draven said, "than a reason to celebrate everything we have built here, rather than simply defending it from those who wished it destroyed." They walked together through the gardens as the afternoon light softened toward evening, past the roses that had replaced the memory of violence with something far gentler, and Illyra found herself thinking of that first terrible day, arrows striking the carriage wheel, a cold king watching her cross a hostile hall, uncertain whether she would survive her own wedding, let alone build a genuine life within these walls. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked quietly. "The arranged marriage, the uncertainty, everything we were forced into by circumstances neither of us chose." Draven considered the question seriously, as he considered most things, before answering. "I regret the pain both our peoples endured before this peace became possible. I regret the years I spent unable to set down grief long enough to see you clearly when you first arrived. But this," he gestured to the gardens around them, to the fortress beyond, to the quiet, steady partnership that had grown between them despite every obstacle thrown in its path. "This, I do not regret at all. I would choose this again, every time, even knowing everything it would cost us to reach it. Even the arrows," Illyra said, a small smile touching her lips. "Even the wolf in the corridor. Even Genevieve's clearing." "Even all of it," Draven confirmed, matching her smile with one of his own, unguarded and genuine in a way that still, even now, made her chest tighten with quiet warmth. "Because every trial only proved what I already suspected, but was too afraid to fully believe, that you were never simply a substitute for anyone, or a symbol imposed on either of us by treaty. You were always exactly who this fortress needed, and exactly who I needed, whether I was ready to admit it or not." That evening, the Great Hall hosted a celebration, unlike any Illyra had witnessed since her wedding feast nearly a year before, though this gathering carried none of the tension and uncertainty of that first cautious night. Human envoys from her father's council sat alongside pack nobles, who had once eyed the alliance with deep suspicion, sharing food and conversation, with an ease that would have seemed impossible during her first uncertain weeks in this fortress. Kale, finally allowing himself to relax from the careful vigilance that had defined most of the past year, raised his cup in a toast that drew warm laughter from the assembled crowd, praising both his king and his queen for weathering storms that would have broken lesser partnerships entirely. Draven rose to speak near the evening's end, his voice carrying easily across the hall that had once witnessed his composure shatter so publicly on their wedding day. "A year ago," he said, "I stood in this hall and watched a veil fall from my wife's face, and I saw, for one terrible moment, a ghost I had never fully allowed myself to release. I ask forgiveness from her, and from this entire court, for how long it took me afterward to see clearly what stood before me, instead of what I feared." He turned to Alira, his golden eyes warm in the torchlight, holding none of the cold calculation that had once defined his every public expression. "What I see now," he continued, "is not a ghost, and never a mere symbol of peace negotiated between exhausted councils. I see Alira, fully herself, chosen freely, and loved completely. The true architect of everything this fortress has become over the past year. Whatever old bloodline history may claim runs through her veins, it was never blood that built this peace. It was her own choices, her own courage, and her own refusal to let any of us, myself included, treat her as anything less than exactly who she is." The hall erupted into applause, warm and genuine, and as Alira rose to stand beside her husband, accepting the celebration of a court that had once regarded her with wary uncertainty, she felt the last remnants of that first frightened bride finally settle into something steadier, something earned rather than simply assigned by treaty and circumstance. Later that night, standing together on the fortress balcony, overlooking mountains finally free of winter's harshest grip, Draven wrapped his arms around her against the cool evening air, and Alira leaned back into the warmth of him, watching stars emerge one by one across the deep blue sky she had once told him she preferred over any noble's gold. "No more ghosts," Draven murmured against her hair. "No more ghosts," Alira agreed. "Only us, and whatever we choose to build next." Below them, the fortress that had once felt so cold and hostile, now hummed with the quiet warmth of a home, finally settled into genuine peace, human and pack lights burning steadily side by side throughout the mountainside, no longer divided by suspicion or old grief, but joined instead by everything Alira and Draven had chosen, deliberately and courageously, to build together, against every force that had tried to tear it apart. The war that had once claimed generations on both sides of the border, finally, truly, belonged to the past, and standing there in her husband's arms, watching the stars complete their slow climb across the northern sky, Alira understood that whatever challenges still lay ahead for their peoples, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything since that first terrible day the arrows struck her carriage wheel. Together and unafraid.